Hello and welcome to the Why Postliberalism Failed podcast. My name is James Patterson. Today is July 25th, 2024. With me is my co-author and co-host, Thomas Howes. Today, we are Sans guest. We are back to the book. How are things going with the book chapter you're on? You're still doing political economy, right?
Yeah, I'm doing political economy right now. Um, I've been going through liberals' thoughts on economic things and also on constitutional design. And right now, I'm trying to get into Adrian Vermeil is the most sophisticated of all of them. He has a lot of thoughts about how the government should be structured. He thinks that most of us Madisonians are tyrannophobic. So, um,
Tyrannophobic. It's such a good
yeah,
term.
yeah, that's right. So I'm
Yeah.
going through his. It's complex though. I mean, he's written a lot about it, and so that's what I'm working on right now. I'm trying to defend the tyrannophobes against Adrian Vermeil.
Yeah, it's not a task that I think I'm temperamentally suited to do because I just, I take the books and I throw them in the trash. But you've got to read yours uh before you got to do that, especially since you made purchases. I hope you bought them used so you didn't send them any
I, I
money.
I tried to buy them used, but they
Yeah.
were actually cheaper new. So
Yeah, normally you want, to support authors, but in this case I think Adrian's doing just fine
yeah.
at HLS. But so today, oh, my book fell over. But today we're actually not working on that chapter. We're going to be probably doing that one soon though. We're doing the chapter that we sort of teased in the last episode with our good friend Kevin Valier. um I've already got 6,000 words into this thing, and a big part of that is that the chapter that I'm working on has a lot of historical data. So the subject of this chapter is that of integralist parties and integralist governments. They have existed. They've made their way into especially late 19th and early 20th century politics. And the nature of these parties is not accidental. It's very intentional. They are self-consciously calling themselves integralist or political Catholics or some variety of a political action for Catholicism. There's some so the cases that will be in the book, this might change, but at least um, the objective is to include three categories of cases. The first is the category I call the failures. So we have integralist parties that failed to secure access to the government. So this is a post-liberalism that failed before it even got started. Um, these integralist parties were the ones in Portugal, Brazil, and eventually Argentina. Argentina is kind of an edge case here because Argentina starts with integralists and then rapidly shoves them out. And the ones that succeed are Spain, early on Argentina, Austria, which gets cut short because of a Nazi assassination of Engelbert Dollfuss, Slovakia, and Croatia. And there might be other cases here. There's a third case that's on its own. This is one that was actually brought to us by someone who was interacting with us on social media, on Twitter at whypostlibfail. They don't allow for long handles on Twitter. I need to find out. I remember who this person is because they did a great job introducing us to a guy named Leon de Grelle, who's Belgian, and he
Hmm.
gets his own category because before Belgian integralism, which is under the Christus Rex party, could really come to a conclusion, Belgium got invaded by Hitler. And then de Grelle, the leader of the Christus Rex party, is like, oh, and then he joined the Waffen SS. So I don't know. That's a special case. I had no idea. The thing about a lot of these cases is that there's a lot of people who don't work in our areas of Catholic political thought that work on this stuff. And there's very little in the way of connection. I actually reached out to the people who wrote an excellent and very condensed volume on integralism in Brazil. It's called Fascism in Brazil, from Integralism to Bolsonarism. So I'll put this up here. We can't link books in our info yet because they think that we might be a spam account. But yeah, so you can see that it might be reversed on your end. And then I use a lot of books on Portugal. There's a great book by Douglas Wheeler on the Portuguese Republic and why it fell apart, and this awesome biography of Salazar by Tom Gallagher. So I don't want to just lecture at you, but maybe I'll get started, and then maybe you pose a few questions if any come to mind, Tom.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah. So the first part of this will be a discussion of why this happened the way that it happened, how these parties emerged, and why they made the efforts that they did. This is going to be a challenging change of point of view for people that grew up in the Anglo-American experience. So if you're like Australian, if you're American, if you're British, maybe not if you're Irish, if you're actually from the Irish Republic. But the reason for this is that a considerable gap in the American or the Anglo-American experience. I forgot to mention Canada, but is the experience with Napoleon. Now, obviously, the British experienced Napoleon, but they don't experience conquest and upheaval of their own political and social world by Napoleon. They just experience it in terms of warfare and disruption to trade and the influence of Napoleon is ultimately what is provoking a lot of the anti-liberal sentiment among Catholic reactionaries. And this frame of reference was one of restoration. So all through the 19th century, there's a desire to rid the continent of the Judeo-Masonic interventions that had introduced the revolution and a conspiracy theory we talked about in episode 2. Not all the monarchists were so paranoid, but there were many that were. And the frame of reference had always been one of conservation of Christendom and its restoration. And by the end of the 19th century, there's a real tension over whether this is going to happen. It's been decades upon decades. The French Third Republic shows not signs of weakening, but of strengthening. By 1906, the more radical Catholics, like the Assumptionists and Action Française, had really pushed their luck and provoked the Third Republic to engage in what's called laïcité, which is still in France today, which is an aggressive separation of church and state. And so the sense of restoration of Catholic Christendom in France is like dire, right? But there are some people who are still holding on to the hope, and we have this the First World War break out. And the First World War is what changes integralists from being conservative in both their politics and in their outlook to revolutionary. And the reason for this is the outcome of the First World War is the annihilation of all that was left that they hoped to use as a basis for restoring throne and altar. The Habsburgs are gone from Austria, replaced by a parliament. Hungary and Serbia and Croatia all become independent states, I believe. So, or did they become Yugoslavia? I think. Serbia and Croatia. I'm getting confused by the outcomes of the First and Second World War. I think they get thrown together in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and they get like a German king. So I'm misremembering. But there's Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland's back. Like after being gone for a while. And so what all these countries end up doing is more or less adopting a liberal parliamentary system. Germany forces out the Kaiser. Um, and in some parts of Europe, they had already had them, such as in obviously in Italy to some degree. Under the Kingdom of Italy, they had a parliament, and the Netherlands and Portugal and places like that, which we'll talk about later. And that's it. It's over, right? It's just liberal parliamentarism had taken over, and a lot of Catholic politically engaged people that had been engaged in a monarchist restoration are utterly bereaved of any sense of restoration, and as a result, they radicalize. And they radicalize along the lines of two figures: an old figure, Charles Marat, whose Action Française becomes a template for creating integralist parties. Everything from organizing everything under a partisan newspaper that was used as a way to distribute a perspective and to make the case for the ideological position that they take, right down to organizing elites that can mobilize voters to select people into office. And the what's funny about all of these ventures is that what the integralists in various parts of Europe are trying to do is to take up office so they can overthrow the regime from within. So it's just like before, right? It's integration from within. This is a post-liberalism that's been tried and in every case failed. So the funny thing is that the other person they like to emulate, so you have Charles Marat, who's an atheist, has a deathbed conversion, but from his entire life is an atheist. The other person they pick's an atheist as a template, and that's Benito Mussolini, whose fascist party comes into power in Italy by creating a paramilitary force called the Squadristi and marching into Rome and forcing the hand of the Italian king to create a position or to replace the previous prime minister with Mussolini. And so in both cases, the models here are to create parties that operate from within parliament until they can operate on parliament. And the aim for all these parties is to restore a Catholic monarchy. And you can see here the shadow of Napoleon, in that a lot of the nations that are going through this experience are ones that had been influenced by his reign on the continent. But this stuff also makes its way across the Atlantic and Latin American countries that had many of their elites study in Europe. So that's one of the reasons why Argentina and Brazil are so affected by this sort of thing. A lot of their leaders were educated in French, Spanish, and Portuguese universities.
Wow, that's so so you're saying that the two biggest intellectual influences here are Charles Marat and Benito Mussolini.
Yeah.
Nowadays, whenever the F word comes up, fascist, right?
Yeah.
People
There's a lot of F words.
with any kind of sympathy to right-wing authoritarianism get very angry if you use that word. They're saying you're calling us a fascist. They get very upset. But I mean, is it unfair to call people who want something like the phalangist, position in Spain, or Action Française in France, or Salazar in Portugal? Is that unfair to call those fascist? What do you think about that?
So this is a term that's been subject to extensive debate precisely because of the ideological usefulness you have in applying the term to people. If you call someone a socialist today, it doesn't quite have the same ring. It doesn't sound like you're really accusing them of anything bad, to the same degree as fascism. Or communist, even though communism did, as much harm in the 20th century as fascism did, especially once you extend it over the period from the immediate period we're talking about through the 20th century. But really, it's not like we want to make that the standard, right? Like, did you do as many killings as Stalin or Mao? If not, then you're better than they are. It's not really a very good standard. But with fascism, what makes it so difficult is that there wasn't one fascism, unless you want to call it the Italian version, because it's the original. Instead, Italian fascism is something of an ideological export that gets its own sort of version. So I'm not sure if you have you ever seen the Kit Kats in Japan, right? You know, so there's like a ton of Kit Kats you can get in Japan, including like matcha flavor, and they don't sell well in the United States. We've got our own, and it's the same with chips. Like you can get like a ketchup flavor chip in England. It sounds disgusting. They don't like our sour cream and cheddar chips, and that's kind of how fascism was, where everyone gets their own kind of version that they're happier with, right? So the fascism you get in Spain is a clerico-fascism, which is extremely tied to the Catholic Church, and this has a lot to do with the fact that the phalangists are making common cause with integralists, and the situation in Spain is absolutely horrible because the Catholic Church, despite the many sins of the clergy there or whatever they might have been, was getting butchered by radicals in the Spanish Republic. And so what you get in Spain is like a situation where everything's terrible and no one is good. And so you end up with Franco and the Phalangist Party making common cause with the church, primarily because Franco was himself, in his own weird way, a devout Catholic. When the similar, although at a much smaller scale, thing happens in Portugal, it happens less so because Salazar is sort of privately religious, but is also concerned about preserving his position atop power and sees embracing a public Catholicism as a threat to that. So in Salazar's Portugal, which we'll talk about later, there's no fascism that is self-consciously fascist, that's assertively fascist, because he tries to keep all of that out. Whereas Franco, is a secret signer of the tripartite compacts, as volunteers to go fight for the Nazis. He's trying to elbow in on the claims that Vichy, France, and Italy have to North Africa. And then he sees the Battle of the Bulge go down the way it does. The next thing you know, he's the biggest friend the Allies ever had.
Yeah, that's right.
it's saving his own skin. That's what Franco was good at. So fascism shows up in other places very differently. There's a friend of mine who really doesn't like it when I describe Dollfuss as an Austro-fascist, because that's not a term that Dollfuss used. It was a term that was used on Dollfuss. But my general view is, if the shoe fits, he did all the things that you normally see with fascism, which is a kind of paramilitary force. They were kind of hilarious because the Austrian paramilitaries were the Heimwehr, and they wore these very silly hats. So it's easy for us to look at them and be like, oh my God, this is no secret police I'm afraid of. But the Austrians are a little different.
You didn't get Hugo Boss to design their outfits?
No. There's nothing stormtrooper looking. They've got these feathers that come out of these capettes, and it's just sort of silly. So the Heimwehr like that, or Heimwehr, excuse me. In Slovakia, however, you have like an actual Catholic priest, and he does, his fascism is much more curtailed from the Italian side and much more Nazi. He actually adopts a much more Hitlerian approach. And then the Ustashi and Croatia are, the leader, a guy named Pavlic, was actually in Italy until the Second World War broke out, as a kind of friend of Mussolini's that he was going to hold on to in case he wanted to use him during the invasion of Greece, or not the Baltics. I keep wanting to say the what is the word I'm looking for? Oh my gosh, I'm like losing my mind. The Baltics is in the north. Balkans, thank you. Oh my goodness. Sorry. So they were right next to each other in the file cabinet, and I got them switched up. But yeah, so eventually, like when Pavlic goes in and starts the Ustashi and starts butchering Jews and Orthodox, he's getting that kind of like from his own kind of wickedness, but the approach that he uses is essentially a carbon copy of what Mussolini did. So fascism is always been very hard to nail down. in terms of its consistent vision. Although I don't have the book on me. There's some really good sorry, I'm getting away from the mic. There's some really good books on the subject. Maybe we'll talk about another episode, or if I can find it while sitting here, I'll use it. And the reason why I bring that up is because I've actually had this argument with a guy named Nathan Pekoski on Law and Liberty, and I, had been reading about theories of fascism. Actually, some of them were stuff that I got recommended to me by a colleague named named Paul here, and I went over and got the stuff that he recommended. So this is an ongoing issue. One thing that's been funny about all this is also learning about how much interaction they actually all had with each other, right? Like, like the Croatians and Mussolini, and one of the guys that goes to Brazil to start the Integralist Party had been to Italy. He had actually gone there to see the future. That's how he understood it. And same with the Argentinians, who brought people like Jacques Maritain over, and also traveled to Italy to see fascism. And they were like, "We're going to make this Catholic, and we're going to do it ourselves." So it's a
Wait, they
really
brought
interesting.
Jacques Maritain over.
Yeah, Jacques Maritain came over to tell him to stop.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's like, what are you doing? And there are all these fights that he has with these guys like Julio Mineville, who a neo-integralist today actually republished some of his work, and did nothing to mention the fact that Julio Mineville was an Argentinian priest who was also like a deranged anti-Semite. Wrote a book called "The Jews as a Mystery of History," and it's a repetition of a lot of things that we talked about in chapter 2. In fact, the highest ranking integralist in Argentina, and this will be in a different episode because I need to get through this, but the highest ranking integralist in the Argentinian government early on was a full-time anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. That was kind of like what he did for the government. He turned out that kind of propaganda.
Well, that's like the Phalangists. They had a office for anti-Masonry in Judaism. They had offices. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I was sharing like the section from another work that I wrote on the Argentinian case. Sorry, I can't do two things at once here, and I'm trying to look up the guy here. Yeah, so that kind of stuff was everywhere, and it wouldn't have been that weird to Catholic monarchists in Spain because they associated that with the extension of the Inquisition. This was just something that was supposed to be part of a properly ordered government, and because the absolute governments in Spain had these inquisitions that were meant to ensure real conversions of Moriscos and Conversos, this is what they used as a way of essentially surveilling them. We talked about this in the Valier episode, right? Like eventually they just get rid of the Jews that won't convert, and then they get rid of the Moriscos, who are the forcibly converted Muslims, thinking them just too insidious and numerous to trust.
Well,
So
they were suspect, right? Because they thought that their conversion was just for political gain, or so that they could have full citizenship, right?
Yeah, and it was it was a bit of a paranoid circumstance, and it sort of points to the fact that there was always this kind of paranoia in the Iberian Peninsula over these things. And so when by the time the Moors are pushed out, who's fills the gap are the Masons, because they become the new subject for fear of subversion. It's I'm not sure how much that holds together, but that's been the what I've surmised, is that Spain was never fully free of this worry that at any moment there could be some kind of external threat. So the idea of the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy is just a continuation of early modern concerns about the conversions that they had forced on people in the conquered parts of Spain from Reconquista.
Yeah. So we were talking about a little bit last time, because we saw you said that when when Perón came to power in Argentina, there were integralists in his coalition.
Yeah.
And you were saying that they eventually got marginalized out of his administration because he saw them as what was it? What was it?
I gotta get this paper open. That's yeah, this is the thing. Let's see if I can find it. So this is from the English Oh, I see. So this unfortunately is mostly in this is all in German, and I wrote this for the Adenauer Foundation, and I've not published it in English. And I really think I probably should try to find a place of home for it. But the thing that you were that I was trying to remember, and Kevin then went on a tear, and I decided, that's fine. We'll talk about it some other time. The Spanish Civil War radicalized Argentinian Catholic nationalists like Cesar Pico, who argued against Jacques Maritain's position against integralism to say that integralism had emerged as a reaction against the calamities ascribed to liberalism, democracy, socialism, and capitalism, a reaction which in its origin is instinctive and that seeks as a doctrine to justify it. Pico then defended Salazar, Dollfuss, Mussolini, and Franco, as Alberto Spectrowski describes Pico in this book, The Origins of the Argentine Revolution of the Right. And other Argentinian nationalists, Catholicism would provide fascism with a doctrine, while fascism would provide Catholicism with a new spirit of political action against the complicity of the agnostic state and fostering the anti-clerical spirit promoted by Masonic lodges and the liberal press.
So this sounds like regime change.
Right. That's right. What we need is the right elites in charge, and the populists, if duly influenced correctly for the common good, will put them there. And this is exactly what comes next. Many Catholic integralists would enter Juan Perón's dictatorship. Perhaps most significantly was the elevation of anti-Semitic writer Gustavo Martinez Zuviria, also known as Hugo Vast, to the Minister of Justice. By no means was Zuviria alone in his anti-Semitism. Rather, was a feature of Argentinian Catholic integralism among priests like Fathers Gustavo Franceschi, Julio Mainville, we mentioned earlier, Leonardo Castellani, and Virgilio Filippo. Even as these figures gained greater access to Argentinian power, Perón favored the military over them, seeing Catholic integralist intellectuals, as well as the fascist ones, as piantavotos, or those who scare away the votes. Rather, their role was as loyalists in the regime and providing public legitimacy to his dictatorship. So this is the short version of the Argentinian case, is that Perón brings these guys in. They're annoying and creepy. And he realizes over time, once he's solidified the loyalty of the military, he doesn't need these guys as much. And he just kind of,
So let's think about this for a second. So before Trump selected J.D. Vance, who's a post-liberal, as his running mate, J.D. Vance scrubbed all reference to being pro-life off of his website. And we're not saying pro-life, we're pro-life, but this is something that also matters to the post-liberals.
Yeah.
And they also scrubbed any and they also scrubbed any mention of it off the official platform at the Republican convention.
Right.
And then we know the post-liberals are all very closely connected with the Heritage Foundation and what's his name, Kevin Roberts, is it?
Well, they want to be, right? We've seen
they want to,
yeah. There's at least an effort to build a bridge there. We saw Gladden was there with the Hungarians.
That's right. That's right.
Recently.
And when Trump last week announced that he wants nothing to do with Project 2025,
that's rough.
He says it's the work of the far left or far right.
Right
work he wants nothing to do with. Rod Dreher goes on Twitter and gets very upset with Trump, calls him deranged and narcissistic. He's like, what are you're basically, slapping in the face the people that are going to be running your administration. No, I've never read Project 2025, but I've heard it connected with this idea of firing bureaucrats and replacing them with loyalists. I'm not sure if that's in there.
Sort of.
But
it's
you
sort
see
of
already, is sort of in there. Okay. You see already the post-liberals are feeling marginalized in this coalition, and we aren't even in November yet.
I have a copy of it. Here it is. Look at the size of this thing.
Oh my
So
goodness.
the idea is the section F that you're describing, which would be the purgation of the purge of political bureaucrats from there, and the way that you can clear out the bureaucracy of ideological extremists would be to allocate them away from the ordinary scheduling they have under the Civil Service Act, which makes them very difficult to fire, and instead they become subject to a special employment schedule called Section F, and then where they're basically at the mercy of the president, and then you just fire them all. And this has been a holy grail for a long time. And what you see with Trump is he doesn't like people trying to claim what he wants to do for him. And that is the one of the through lines that's been around for a very long time with him. And the subject of 2025 kind of grew because I think Kevin Roberts, who I know, there's a picture of me receiving an award from Heritage somewhere. There's a picture of me, and I'm sure whatever I'm wearing, Derek Guy or whatever that guy's name is, dye workwear, would definitely not like what I'm wearing. But that was a very online comment. I'm sorry, but I'm always terrified that one day I'm going to get reviewed by him in a picture. Not that I matter that much, but you never know. I might be just an object lesson for the day. Anyway, so Kevin Roberts was sort of pushing Project 2025 a lot as a way to kind of gain greater access to Trump, but also because he's running a 501c3 that depends on donations, and so this was a great way for him to market the Heritage Foundation as a political action side, because there's Heritage Action, and he got kind of kicked in the teeth. And this is what happens with all factions. Integralists in this respect aren't unique. It's whenever you decide that it's not going to be about a constitutional republic in which you represent your views and try to form coalitions so that the two of you can figure out what majority on an issue you can get in order to get something passed and signed. Instead, if it's going to be about commitment to a particular person who you see as capable of doing everything that you need to do, regardless of any objections from political minorities or even political majorities, unfortunately, that means that you now need to deal with that person, and his interests aren't going to be your interests. Trump's interests are not that of the Heritage Foundation. They're certainly not that of Gladden Papin or his boss in Hungary, and Viktor Orban and Viktor Orban's bosses, which are not the European Union. What kind of nationalism allows the Chinese to come in and police people in your own country? Orban's got a funny concept of nationalism. Anyway,
Chinese nationalism in Hungary.
That's right. Is it nationalist to let the Chinese, police come in and police other Chinese people instead of you?
Oh man. So we've been kind of yucking it up a little bit, I guess, because you and I were a little bit more supportive of sort of the old fusionist mentality on the right, and for the last several years, the post-liberals have been sort of ostracizing us and excluding us because we don't know what time it is. We need to stop thinking about persuading people and think about using power when we have it. And now that they're close, they're in proximity of this power that they want to get things done. Now, when political reality sets in and Trump tells them we can't do that, we've got to win elections or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, Now they're like, well, what did Sohrab Ahmari say a couple weeks ago? Guys, politics is the art of the possible.
I remember I remember when that was David Frenchism, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
Um yeah, that was always the problem, is that I think in a different context, um I've had someone describe this as the law of gravity still holds, right? And
Mhm,
there are certain maybe not as absolute as the law of gravity, but there are certain rules in politics that remain the same regardless of who is in power. And one of these is the principal agent problem, which is the
mhm,
principal, in this case, Trump, and the agent, that is all these different people that are trying to represent him in the public square, do not actually have the same interests. And it's very hard to align them.
mhm,
And so when someone like Sorab says the art of the possible, he's doing this to run interference for the person he sees as most likely to benefit him. Um, it was done actually in advance of Vance's nomination, or even declared intention for Trump to nominate him. And so, in many respects, what we were being told is that in order for us to use power in a way that is going to advance the common good, we need to not use power in that for the common good. Uh, right. And that what we need to have is like a fusion of different perspectives in which people are again. So what was the fusionism we got? Well, we got a fusionism of global isolationism, tariffs, and moderately pro-choice positions, and this is the Republican Party of the 1950s. What's funny is when movement conservatives are called rhinos,
mhm,
um, uh, the term rhino stands for Republican in name only, and that was a movement conservative epithet against the 1950s Republican Party.
mhm.
So we, what is it? History repeats itself as first was as a tragedy, then as farce, and this is very much a farce. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I mean, I saw it coming.
Mhm,
I didn't see. I was definitely not surprised to see Vance get the nomination. I think we talked about that a lot in the third one, because this is definitely something that people have been gunning for. And Valier was very right to point out that it wasn't just this kind of post-liberal angle that we're talking about, but also the tech sector angle, where Vance's connection to Peter Thiel has
mhm,
benefited him and will probably benefit Trump by giving him access to a lot of resources.
mhm. And we talked about how these people, well, see, what seems to unite them all is their hatred of the left and their hatred of globalism
Mm-hmm.
and several other things, and their willingness to, in their sort of aversion to persuasion and democracy, their attraction to using power. Um, that might not be common to them and all of the populist right, but of those few groups that we mentioned. And so this idea of firing bureaucrats and replacing them with loyalists seems very much in their intentions, that they
Right.
wanted they want an administrative state working for them.
It makes sense that this is a form of government that um, resembles what they want more than a republic, because the corporation as a model looks more like what Adrian's arguing for, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
there is a person at the top who's making decisions, and the role of government is to find ways of implementing those decisions. And so Americans go from being citizens to subjects, and the private ownership of the regime under some kind of dictator becomes the model. And so we're back to a kind of monarchism, and it's a person who is one of the more influential figures. Although maybe I think Valier's right that he's kind of, you know, uh, in sort of decline in terms of his originality, such as it was. That's Curtis Yarvin.
Yeah.
Um, and so if you're a corporate CEO, a person who works in the tech sector in a C-suite office, you do not hold votes on the decisions you make, unless it's a board that's voting. And most of the time, you don't listen to the board if you can possibly get away with it. So it makes sense. It becomes more about control and administration than it does about representation, individual liberty, and the preservation of property. And I remember all the way back in I think 2019, I actually wrote about this at Law and Liberty in a essay called After Republic and Virtue. People who are formed in the academic or corporate world really don't have the same kind of instinct for Republican government because they're used to top-down administration and have honed skills and methods of interacting that are based along those. The person who owns his own business and lives in a moderate-sized city, will have like nasty bumper stickers or truck nuts or something like that. And the reason they'll do that is because they can. Right? They don't have a boss. They're the boss. And if you have a problem with it, feel free to have your HVAC not fixed. Maybe you'll find the woke blue-haired girl to come fix it. Oh wait, no, she doesn't want to do that. That's not the job she's in. So I guess you're coming back to me. But if that same guy's like mid-level manager in a global corporation, he's much easier to cow because he has a lot of different people he has to obey. And the blue-haired girl scares him because she's very different from what he thinks and might report him. So a lot of tech people don't like that way of being handled, and so there's internal to tech a lot of opposition to wokeness that is kind of trying to reclaim that same kind of personal liberty you have if you owned your own business. But in that effort, they're actually appealing to a pretty nasty ideology in the process.
Now so we've kind of connected the two movements again. So let's go back then to the past. Then what were a couple instances of in the past of the proto post liberals coming to power then?
Yeah. So the story we just told very quickly. So there's maybe some things we got wrong, maybe some things that were alighting or whatever, but this is just let's just accept it as understood. This is not new, right? The idea of wealthy business owners seeking to create some kind of stability in a government, because not only does it cause them to lose business and domestic customers as a market, but they're sort of vaguely patriotic. They certainly don't like the idea of people getting hurt, and so they're looking for solutions to this, but solutions that also satisfy their own personal interests. And so the example that I have completed in this chapter is actually Portugal. And Portugal is a very interesting case to start with, both for this podcast and for the book, because the person who ends up on the other side of all of these internal dynamics, a man named António de Oliveira Salazar, excuse me, is not a monster. Look at this guy. Look at Salazar. Does he look like a monster to you? I mean, look at that hairline at that age. I mean, I should be so blessed, right? But he is not a good person either. But I mean, when we get into some of the other cases in this chapter, Salazar really comes off as a pretty decent person. Again, we're the relative scale is not always the best one in this case. But to understand how we end up with Salazar requires an appreciation of how bad things got for Portugal. Like the way we're normally taught history, and K through 12 education in the United States is, Portugal and Spain started to colonize. Spain got everything except for Brazil in the Western Hemisphere, and Portugal got, originally they got Africa and East Asia and South Asia. So the Portuguese end up everywhere from, the west coast of Africa and start the slave trade, to South Africa, to Goa and India. They visit Japan. They, have outposts in in Indonesia. And so you think, and then next thing you hear about Portugal, all that's gone. You don't know what happened. Well, Portugal, of course, gets their clock cleaned by the Dutch, and the Dutch take that stuff from them in many cases, and so do the British. Although the British really take it from the Dutch, not so much the Portuguese. And the British are very important here because one of the oldest alliances in the history of the world is the alliance between the English, eventually the British carry it over, and Portugal. And despite the fact that England goes through its Reformation and has very different cultures and the like, this alliance remains and intact. I think it has a lot to do with wine. The English like wine and they can't grow it as well as the Portuguese can. So classic example,
like a port.
Yeah, at a port, like the classic example, comparative advantage, right? Like, anyway. So unfortunately for Portugal, the British become overwhelmingly more powerful than Portugal. And so the alliance really becomes more of a kind of, I don't know, vassalage is too strong of a term, but it's pretty close. And the British want more territory in Africa. At the time, Portugal owns the territories of Mozambique and Angola. And Carlos I, at the time of 1890, more or less is told in what's called the British ultimatum, we're going to take this land and you're going to be okay with it. And he says, okay. Now, this sounds like 1890. I thought we were talking about the 1930s. Like, why are we starting 43 years earlier? Well, ladies and gentlemen at home, what kicks off after the British ultimatum is unbelievably complicated, and that's why it's taken me this long to get through. So I will give you the short version of the short version that's in the chapter. So how does it look? Well, after this happens, the republicanism effort in Portugal begins to gain a lot of ground because the king is seen as weak and unable to really stand up to other foreign governments. Now, the Republicans here that are making these arguments, little r Republicans, meaning that they want to start a republic, although they're big R Republicans in Portugal, they are not the GOP, right? So that might get confusing to some people, maybe. So what happens is there's a group called the Carbonaria. Now, we've talked about the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory, but what you have to understand is that the conspiracy is not made up out of whole cloth. Rather, what they do is they take bits and pieces of things that are observable on their own and then illogically or illicitly connect them as part of the whole here. Now, the Carbonaria are an offshoot of the Masonic Lodge, and they, are tied up in this idea of getting rid of the monarchy by force. And so two people that are influenced by this idea, Manuel Buicha, I think is how you say that. I have no idea how to speak Portuguese, excuse me. And Alfredo Costa just shoot Carlos in the face, kill him. All right. And then and on in February 1st, 1908, and his heir, Luis Felipe, he gets shot too. While he is actually shooting the other one of the two assassins. And so his little brother, Manuel II, who had absolutely no expectation of ever becoming king, is 18 years old, becomes king, and is, as you might expect of any 18-year-old, is terrible at it. And so within a couple years, he's actually deposed in 1910, October 4th. And that's it for the monarchy. It's gone. It's replaced by a republic. The republic is a complete disaster. Okay. First of all, it takes a very long time for it to get off the ground. There's something called the provisional government that's making a bunch of decisions in advance of there being any parliamentary elections. And the people that are part of this are mostly intellectuals with absolutely no experience in government. So they have an idea of what liberalism is, what their ideological desires are, but they don't know how to run anything. They don't have any experience in dealing with competing interests and negotiating agreements, unintended consequences of legislation. They just know that what they want to do is they want to turn Portugal into the French Third Republic. And so one of the first things they do before there's any parliament in place as the provisional government is they try to pass something called the separation law. The separation law is um, an effort to completely separate the church from the state. And so what this would do was kind of remove the final. They got rid of the monarchy, the throne. Now they got to get rid of the altar, right? And so that's what the
Mhm.
law of separation would do. So in April of 1911, they get the law passed. It's supposed to take place on the first. The person who's responsible for this is a guy named Afonso Costa. Not the same. He's not related to the Costa that shot up the king and his heir. That's a different Costa.
Mhm.
A lot of Costas in this story. It was extremely difficult for me to parse. Again, not having any knowledge of Portuguese as a language. So this attack on the church, there's a lot of things in the law that are nasty, is what starts to provoke the formation of an integralist party. Now, the integralists during this period are monarchists, but you can see that, like, when it officially forms in 1914, a guy named Antonio Sardina is the one who does it. Um, they're more revolutionary than the other monarchists, who are very conservative. Many of them come from aristocratic families. That's not these people. But the reason why they still like it is because they still think that there's something to recover, something to restore. According to Douglas Wheeler, they supported the return to Portugal's oldest and, in their opinion, most cherished traditions: church, monarchy, family, the land, and professional corporations based on medieval guilds. And what they saw as the cause for the overthrow of the monarchy was Freemasonry. And the way that they hoped to do it increasingly was following the example of Primo de Rivera, who was at the time the dictator in Spain, according to Wheeler, again in quotation, resolving the internal political problem with force. Um, so the law of separation, before it can ever be implemented, gets kind of softened. And who's the one responsible for doing this in Portugal? It's a trick question. This is the British again. The British tell Portugal what their laws can and cannot be. Sovereign is the queen, anyway, or king. Sovereign is he who decides the exception. The exception to the law of separation is actually English clerics. Not subject to this. So if you're like an Anglican, but there's also sort of English Catholic orders that fled to Portugal during the English Reformation, and those people were also given much more leeway than they were supposed to have before. So when they finally have a constitutional convention and implement the constitution that they emerge with in 1914, I want to make sure it's that right. Yeah. Well, no. 1911. Um, they have no real executive authority. It's there as a prime minister, but they're trying to do is they're trying to remedy the problem of monarchism by getting rid of any kind of monarchical figure. Right. This will sound familiar to a lot of Americans. And our
Mhm.
first effort at a constitution did something similar in the Articles of Confederation. This is terrible for Portugal, which is extremely accustomed to there being some kind of executive figure, and nobody really knows how to be in politics without it. And under the monarchy, there had been a parliament under constitutional monarchy that had been relatively calm, and without the monarchy as a kind of anchor for it, they become increasingly radicalized by each other. So the Republicans become a radical, and in response, the monarchists become a radical. And this process unfolds during the First World War. So that by the end of the First World War, um, or coming to the end of the First World War, the Republic falls apart, and a guy named Sidonio Pais goes into office, nominally a little R Republican, but very strongly backed by integralists. He goes in, starts a new republic, and get this, it's modeled after Wilsonian vision of the American Constitution. I'm not sure if they put any, there's this great example of how bad Wilson's views were in Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois, Wilson puts like a man in the American bureaucracy, a black man in a cage, because he can't fire him. He needs him there, but he is concerned about him interacting with white people. So this is a bad model to adopt, right? But Pais, you have to remember, is part of this integralist backed effort. And within a year, he's dead. And he dies because it's really unclear how he's going to be able to be this president, and actually satisfy all the demands that were placed on the republic. So his initial effort to seize government, impose a kind of progressive, capital P, progressive American style constitution, was building up expectations that he could not satisfy. And this was primarily the result of this increased polarization. So at this point, a lot of this should sound familiar, right? There's a lot of winner take all politics. There's a very strong sense of mutually radicalizing parties, a desire for someone to enter into office and solve all of the problems all at once, something that no one can do, and then an assassination attempt. You know,
okay, yeah.
This one succeeds, the other one misses because he was staring at, looks over at a screen, saved by the the grace of God, as Donald Trump says he was. First part of that speech was really good, and then the rest of the speech kind of classic mess of anyway. So what ends up happening with Pais is that the government sort of limps along for a few years. There's an attempt by monarchists to pose a coup again. And this one, they create what's called the Monarchy of the North. Sounds very Game of Thrones. But it's just, all that happens is monarchists seize the government in Lisbon, but it's really just confined to Lisbon, and they're kind of shooed out. They declared the restoration of the monarchy, and the heir to the now abolished throne, Manuel II, living quite nicely in the United Kingdom, is like, I don't know who these people are. I don't want it. I don't want to go back to this, right? Like he's kind of done. He doesn't want these people. And so as by 1925, there have been multiple efforts to overthrow the government. None of them have succeeded. But this time it succeeds. And one of the big reasons why it happens is Portuguese industrialists are experiencing unbelievably high taxes as a result of the decisions made by Republican governments since 1918. And there was another effort to increase taxes. And at this point, you have to understand some things about the Portuguese economy. It's very agricultural. About 60 to 70% of the people in Portugal are illiterate or functionally illiterate, and was highly dependent on Great Britain for its trade and for assistance in keeping the peace in its colonial possessions. And there was a real sense that they were losing control of their entire country. The British were engaging in increasing foreign investment in Portugal that made them seem as though that they were becoming part of the British Empire. And so in 1925, the young officer corps at this point had gone through about 10 years of education that had been entirely controlled by integralists. So these young officers had essentially integrated from within, right? They had been taught by people like Salazar, who had been a professor before going into government.
Wait, James, where have we heard integration from within before?
Right. That's right. That's the idea, right? Like it's not new. We've heard this as a concept used by post-liberals today. And the integralists controlled the university, something that we obviously don't have today, unless we're talking about a select few, maybe like I don't know, Steubenville. I don't know either. Maybe not. I don't know.
Don't sue us, Steubenville. I don't know.
Yeah, we're just kidding around here. But so what they end up doing is they produce very rapidly an officer corps that is integralist, not just in its sort of theological vision, but in its political party and loyalty. And so what happens is that they form a coup, and then they deploy it, and very quickly succeed in a way that others had failed. Um, they had tried it once and it failed. This time they learned from their mistakes, succeeded, and they put a man named General Manuel Gomez de Costa. This is our third Costa, and they do a classic Machiavelli move where Costa goes in. He's very closely tied to the Integralists. He does a bunch of things that are very unpopular. Doesn't seem to be very good at his job, and then he's fired. So it's if you guys remember anything from the Prince, there's this guy in the paper in Romagna that cleans up the place using a lot of violence, and then Duke Valentino has him executed.
Yeah, he has him split in half in the town square or something, right?
Yeah, and there's a knife placed next to his corpse, and in a stump. And Machiavelli's line is, "They were left satisfied and stupefied."
Yeah, I think that was Cesare Borgia, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, DaCosta completely intact bodily. All right, like fine. He just goes. He just leaves. And the reason why this happens is that he was never actually in charge. There was a junta that was more or less controlling the situation. And to replace DaCosta is a man named Oscar de Fragoso Carmona. Are you ready to hear a fact about Carmona?
I'm ready.
He is a Freemason. Guys, I was like, what?
Just like
the Integralists put a Freemason as dictator. The Judeo-Masonic conspiracy is so elaborate that it actually conspired with the Integralists to put a Freemason in charge of Portugal. Anyway, Carmona he is there for the same reason DaCosta that was there, which was to be a face for a junta that could be sort of swapped out whenever things got bad. But under Carmona, things actually began to kind of calm down. And a big reason for this was actually Salazar, who was finance minister. António de Oliveira Salazar is a professor who does a lot of work on economics. At least was recently doing work on economics at the time of the coup. He enters into the minister as a finance minister in this junta, and it turns out he's pretty good at it. Now, if you're the finance minister and there's no functioning parliament, this really means that you have the power of the purse. So this is a very powerful position that he was in. And so, throughout this time, he's actually personal friends with Charles Marat, and the two of them are writing while he's in office. And what eventually happens is that with the alliances in the church, there's a guy named Cardinal Manuel Sorrejera. I'm not sure how to say that in Portuguese. Who was his buddy? He was Patriarch of Lisbon, which used to be a really big deal, still a big deal in Portugal. And he confessed to his friend the Cardinal that he hoped to be the prime minister to an absolute monarch, and he kind of gets to be that. Carmona is not a monarch; he's a military dictator. But when he sees Salazar's capability in administering the government, Carmona is not like a dictator with a tremendous amount of ambition. He just hands the reins over to Salazar, and collects a check every month. And so Salazar finally seizes control of the government. And this is big news because Salazar appears to be an integralist. He had, close ties to very monarchist elements in the church. He stated in a 1922 conference that the view that all authority emanated from God and not from any kind of social contract was his. It was a Christian social order based on hierarchy, one ultimately guaranteeing the common good from which authority flowed. Where have we heard this kind of language before? I ask you, Tom.
Yeah.
Right. So the social contract, as he understands it, this kind of continental liberalism of Rousseau, right? Not the kind of contractarian theories that came out of Salamanca and made their way to the Anglo-American tradition. And this idea of the common good as the source for authority then means that you have a hierarchical social order that's imposed downward. And
Mm-hmm.
this way of thinking really makes sense when you have a very large population of people who work with their hands in the ground and can't read, right? How are they going to rule themselves?
Mm-hmm.
And so what he says is uh, in the formation of a party that replaces all other political parties called the National Union, in English, is there is a necessary hierarchy of values in a well-ordered society. And so in anticipation of the 1933 Constitution, integralists are hearing this. They can't quite get to him, in many cases, but they think that he's going to be one of theirs. He hires a guy named Caetano and someone else here I mentioned, who are like members of the Integralist Party, the Portuguese Integralist Party.
Caetano, like, is that like Cajetan? Like, get Cait?
I don't know if they're related. I'm sorry. I'm trying to find this. I'm like summarizing
Oh, I'm
here.
just wondering because in Italian, Caetano is how you say Cajetan, and I was wondering if that was like he took that. It was like is that his first name or his last name?
That was his last name. I
Oh,
got the
okay,
names
okay, never
here.
mind. Common name.
This is annoying me. Marcelo Caetano and Pedro Teotonio Pereira.
Oh,
They're the two people that are integralists. So it looks like this is an integralist takeover. Everyone's ready. Now, the
yeah.
result of the 1933 Estado Novo Constitution is as follows, and this is from Gallagher. The integralists were bitterly disappointed and turned their backs on Salazar. Far
Hmm.
from the undoing the liberal inheritance which they felt had blighted the evolution of Portugal for over a century, they believed far too many concessions had been made to parliamentarianism at a time when it was in collapse elsewhere.
Hmm.
Salazar stabbed them in the back.
Yeah.
He mined them for talent that would be loyal to him, got them
Mm-hmm.
to ingratiate themselves to him so that he could displace any competition within their faction. But all of
Mm-hmm.
his attention was focused on securing all of the authority that being finance minister would give him and making good with the army. And so once he had a constitution that was based on his authority and backed by the army's approval, he didn't need the integralists anymore.
Wow.
In
Hmm.
fact, and this is a person who, Adrian Vermeule has celebrated. If you go look at his Ralliement article in the Josias, you'll go see that he refers to two nations that are very good at administering the laws. One of them is China, because of course it is. And the other one is Salazar. And so let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about what Salazar's integralism was like. When he was negotiating with the church, what he did was the first thing that he did is he never went to Fatima, from what I can tell, or never made much reference to Fatima when it occurred. He kind of stayed in Lisbon and stayed away from Fatima, so he wouldn't be, as Gallagher puts it, in public. Salazar held aloof from Fatima and allowed negotiations to drag out with the Catholic Church from 1936 to 1940. Here's what he refused to do. The first thing he refused to do was to create a Catholic confessional state. So no
Mm-hmm.
integralism.
Mm-hmm.
And then policies that integralists, would favor. He does not abolish secular marriages. And this is what the church was requesting from Portugal at the time, by the way. A guy
Mm-hmm.
named um, Archbishop Pietro Ciriaci. So he doesn't abolish secular marriages. And he insisted that Catholic marriages had to be registered with the state. He denied the church tax exemption, refused to compensate them for damages from the Republican years, and denied the church the ability to form labor unions and employment organizations. The only concession he gave was that there would be compulsory religious education, that if you were married in the Catholic Church, you could not get divorced. And he gave them some money to build churches in the Portuguese colonies. And the impression that Archbishop Ciriaci had of Salazar was he was a demonic incarnation. so here we have Salazar, one of Vermeule's favorite statesmen, and the Catholic Church sends a nuncio to negotiate a concordat, and his conclusion is that Salazar is a demon. This is classic. This is why
Wow.
post-liberalism fails every time, is they
Wow.
try to make a deal with a strong man who's going to do an integralism, And the
Doing
only thing that's
integralism.
worse than getting sold out, like, is actually them doing it, because as we will see in later episodes.
Oh man. So what would after so like after that? I mean, so Salazar, I always heard he had like his political enemies killed sometimes, or he did some things. I mean, it was still a dictator.
He was still a dictator, and this is what
Hmm.
gets us to the relevance of Vallier's chapters.
Hmm.
So Vallier's got three criteria, or three problems with integralism. We had the transition, we had stability, and we have justice. And I'm remembering them now because I've had to write this chapter. Um, so the way that the criteria worked was, let's see if I can find it. Yeah, so the problem of transition is one of leadership failures, internal resistance, and external opposition. Stability has to do with preventing pluralism from emerging from an integralist state,
Hmm.
right? And the more coercion you use, supposedly, the more integralist and less pluralist your society will be. And that's the chapter with the graphs, because like at a certain
Yeah.
point, there's diminishing returns of coercion, and it may never actually
Hmm.
get you to the level you need to be
That's right.
integralist. And then the justice issue is one of violating what are often thought to be natural rights or the violation of natural law. And as it turns out,
Sorry.
bless you. As it turns out, there are a few things about this Salazar's rule that do not fall. Um, excuse me, do not fail these criteria. The one is that Salazar, as a leader, was pretty good at doing the job of like being a leader for Portugal, right? He
Hmm.
navigated them through crises, got them out of major debt crisis, stopped all the civil strife and coups d'etats. And he was not personally corrupt. One of the weird things about a lot of these dictators is that they typically enrich themselves on the public dole. And Salazar was temperamentally a very modest person, never married, loved his mother. There's some questions about maybe he had girlfriends or, something, even more illicit. But more or less, this is a man who, um, you know, just kind of went to work every day. Doesn't really travel, doesn't have like a giant pool or a presidential villa. Um, but in every other respect, we have a problem with Salazar. The first is when it comes to issues of internal resistance. Internal resistance means, people who disagree with Salazar and want to introduce some degree of disagreement that can be hashed out in public. So Salazar crushed all political parties, neutered parliamentary authority. They essentially became, as an institution, Parliament became a body that made recommendations for Salazar to consider,
Hmm.
but they had no independent authority from him. And he also crushed the Catholic Church. And essentially, the cardinal that was his friend eventually becomes alienated from him because
Hmm.
he can't get Salazar to listen to anything that he has to say. And when it comes to external issues, um, he used secret police. He used an organization called the PIDE to engage in all kinds of assassinations. So just to go through it, the original name was the PVDE of his secret police, but it becomes PIDE. So we've got he crushes fascist parties, which that's nice. And then he crushes the Communist Party, which uh, I don't have a fan of fascists or communists, but he's not allowing any party activity. It's the National Union Party. It's the only
Hmm.
party that's allowed. Uh, and the person who's the leader of the Portuguese Communist Party, he ends up putting in jail without trial and in a prison and leaves him there until he dies in 1942. He locks up an advisor named Enrique Gaval for demanding more humane treatment of indigenous populations in the Portuguese Ultramar. Um, Originally, the secret police tried to arrest him. Um, sorry. I mean, this is someone different. I'm like trying to read and go back and forth here. So we have the imprisonment of Gaval. Then we have a guy named Umberto Delgado. This is in the 50s. So this is like even like really late into the Salazar reign, who spoke out against the government. And he's murdered by the secret police in 1965.
Hmm.
And he also murders a man named Jose Diaz Coelho, who was a communist organizer. And he engages in nationwide persecution of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, I'm not a fan of the Jehovah's Witness church. I'm not, but I don't know. Like, we have rights of conscience normally. But yeah, I mean, he cracked down on people, murdered his political opponents. And I should point out, this is the best. Like, this is the nicest post-liberal we're going to get. like when we get to Pavlich and the Ustashi, it's gonna be like it's gonna be 100,000 times worse than this.
Oh no! Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
So we also see. Did he crack down on the Integralists at all? Besides
he
betraying
did.
their ends,
Yeah,
he
the
did.
leader of the Integralists who publicly spoke against him. Let me see if I can find his name. Ippolito or Ippolito. I can't. There's an accent over the O.
Mm-hmm.
Raposo was forced into exile in 1940.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so the Integralists are essentially beheaded within 7 years of 1933. So again, this is the kind of administration that post liberals like Adrian Vermeule see as really good, right? What he wants is the demonic incarnation to tell the church no to integralism. And this is the kind of thing that lets you know that a lot of these things these people say they either don't know much about or is purely aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
If I decided to go look up this stuff about Salazar. It's not like this book is for sale on Amazon. It's not expensive. And you read about it and the guy's a jerk and he's not an integralist. Don't claim him.
No, he's a post-liberal,
And
but
he's a post-liberal.
but
Yeah.
he's an anti-integralist post-liberal. Right.
So he would be more than happy for the Catholic Church to create a culture that has absolutely no appetite for political opposition to Salazar. And that's what he
Wow.
sees the role of the church is.
Mm-hmm.
And so he is a post-liberal before he's an integralist. And if integralism means unseating his position atop the dictatorship, then he will kill everybody who will stand in his way. He just doesn't have to. And
Wow.
temperamentally, Salazar, because by the time Salazar takes over, there's already been an incredible amount. I mean, like, remember, this story started in 1906.
Yeah.
And the Estado Novo Constitution is in 1933, right? Like it is
Mm-hmm.
27 years in a whole world war, and people are exhausted. So
Mm-hmm.
Salazar is the one who kind of pulls their feet from the fire, and by that point, people are just happy that they're not killing each other, and that maybe they'll be able to actually afford food at the market again.
I also noticed that, there's a huge contrast how you describe Salazar with how I understand Franco to be,
Yes.
or the Phalanges. When I was uh, oh, sorry. When I was
Sorry.
I'm listening to audiobook about Franco right now in the Phalanges. They were so paranoid about the Jewish people and
Yeah.
the Masons, and they really were so paranoid. And they had held their whole mentality was us versus them, and they all sound now like a little bit nuts. And I think even to them, they sound, if they look back to the years of the 1930s from like the 1950s, they kind of lied about what happened in the 1930s because even they realized it sounds nuts in retrospect. That seems to be the
Yeah.
pattern of Franco's people, was they basically lied about their past later on, because I mean it was just a really drunk. It was just a really drunk first decade of their power. Um, but yeah, I don't hear that a lot at all with Salazar. He wasn't too paranoid about these
So
outside
The
factions.
way that Gallagher describes the difference between Salazar and the other sort of fascist, clerico-fascist, integralist, sort of right-wing authoritarian sort of orbit
Mm-hmm.
of the time is that he was anti-political. And this is
Hmm.
what makes him oddly liberal. with the
Mm-hmm.
in that, a certain kind of modern liberal actually prefers administrative government as a way of purging um, populist elements out of government because they're considered disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you need is rule by experts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the sort of capital P progressive era of the United States, which, as I mentioned earlier, like there are people in Portugal reading that stuff, right? These are not the elites in Portugal are not cut off from the rest of the world the way that the illiterate um, agricultural workers are. And so what Salazar essentially creates is a kind of rule by the best expert, right? The
Mm-hmm.
person, and the way that he can preserve his hold is to satisfy the military so that they're getting what they want, and then to demobilize all other political parties.
Mm.
He does not want people to be involved in politics at all. He wants people to be involved in, he encourages the Catholic Church to create sort of voluntary associations.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't do this because he's like a Burkean, little platoons guy. It's because if the church is going to be busy, he wants them busy doing things that aren't going to interfere with his position.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea is very much opposed to the idea to the approach of someone like Franco, who was mobilized much more on the idea of opposing some kind of external force.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this has a lot to do with the unique condition Portugal is in. It's all the way at the end of the European subcontinental peninsula. It's a relatively minor power. It hadn't been a major power in a long time. And so its objectives in someone from a right integralist sort of school of thought is just to preserve the nation from being completely taken over by larger economic forces. And Salazar satisfies that. And the terms for satisfying that also means excluding a lot of integralist claims and policies. And more or less, other people are fine with that, especially if they're not communists. If they are communists, then they might get shot and die.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't. Yeah. So maybe the integralists should be a little bit more cautious about aligning with like people who are like Wilsonian administrative state types.
That's right. Yeah,
Mm.
I'm not saying that like Salazar was cuddling up at night reading a congressional government or whatever was the name of the Wilson's like magnum opus on administrative state, but he certainly had that approach, even if he wasn't like a student of Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you look at who these people are, they're much more complicated, and he's part of this category of people who kind of cut off integralists before they can even take power. And as I mentioned earlier, the even worse examples of integralists are the ones who actually succeed
That's
in
right.
gaining access to political power, because those people are truly heinous.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's some aspects of Salazar that kind of seems, maybe this is the best Portugal could do, right?
Yeah.
It's honestly, it's like when you read Franco,
Mm-hmm.
when you read about Franco and you're listening to that audiobook, I'm getting that book whenever they are able to ship new copies.
Mm-hmm.
When you read about the Spanish Civil War, you're kind of like, can't they both lose? Because they're
Yeah.
both such
No.
reprehensible
Mm-hmm.
groups. You read
Mm-hmm.
Salazar and you're kind of like, you know what? Like, I'm not sure if there was anyone that was going to do any better with this mess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just a
So
very bad situation.
yeah, and so when people recommend Salazar to you, what they're also recommending is that the United States be an economic basket case that suffered like 24 coup attempts, right? Like I'd rather not.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems like they yeah. Yeah, that's right. Gosh, the man, it's not looking
But you know
good
what
for
happens after
post-liberalism.
Salazar dies, right? Like, what does
What
Portugal
happens?
become an integralist superstate?
No.
Becomes a
What is
liberal
it? What happens?
democracy.
Hmm.
Like
Interesting.
all
So
Salazar.
post-liberalism failed.
So post-liberalism failed.
Right.
The liberalism of Portugal failed in the Republican period because it was too monarchical. right? They were trying to essentially supplant decision making from the king onto this like provisional government, and assume that parties that would emerge would declare secularism like a king might. And then when Salazar comes in as a kind of rejection of that, his post-liberalism ultimately fails because he's trying to do the same thing that the liberal Republicans were trying to do. He essentially tries to become his own version of a king. He wants to become prime minister to an absolute monarch. He ends up becoming the monarch. So this post-liberalism failed, and it was only lasted as long as it did because the stakes in Portugal were low, and Salazar was wise not to side with the fascists in Europe during the Second World War. He kind of stays out of it. And generally,
he actually really stayed out of it, not like Franco.
Yeah, not like Franco, who was really good at lying to people who wanted to be lied to. And we'll get to Franco. Franco's his own episode. But Salazar is staying out of it, and again, it has to do with this very long diplomatic relationship with the British. But I mean, let's be honest here. What was he going to do during the Second World? Was Salazar going to like create a fleet of submarines to sink all of American material ships? No. They didn't have the capital or the political will to do stuff like that. So Portugal just stayed out of it. There has been European power in their own minds, and they would just very much like not to be broke and illiterate anymore. And Salazar rescued them from that. It took a couple decades of secret police surveillance to get there, and they were glad to see him gone when he died.
They didn't miss him too much?
I actually had a student from Portugal, and I just decided to ask her. I said, I was reading an article talking about how great Salazar was. What do you think of Salazar? And she looked at me like I was crazy, but not like he was terrible, but like, Salazar, did he die in like the 70s? I don't know anything about him. It's like, I don't think my parents like him very much, but no one does. It's like,
don't they even talk about him in civics class?
It's just over Salazar. It's not like, hey, do you guys still like the monkeys? Or like, do you still really like to drink tab? It was extreme. It was like I brought up something that was like embarrassing and cringe. And this is not like some lib. I teach at a Catholic liberal arts college, and this woman is devout Catholic, and it was just weird. It's just weird that people were bringing up Salazar to her. It's like she was surprised that I even knew who he was, and that just tells you exactly how bananas all this is. And you and I have been doing it for so long that we're kind of used to talking about Salazar. But do you know who doesn't talk about Salazar? It's literally everyone else.
Yeah, that's right. I have to admit, I never ever thought about Salazar ever until I was at a Philadelphia Society gathering, and they had an integralist there, and they asked him what his favorite leaders were, and he said Salazar.
Oh boy. Demonic incarnation, according to the Catholic Church.
It was just, he said Salazar, and it was one other person. But
integralists love to mention Salazar because he was not outwardly anti-Semitic.
That's right.
I don't think he had strong opinions on the Jews. Of course, the reason why the Portuguese will not have strong opinions on the Jews is that they had mostly lost all of theirs. That letter that Washington writes to the synagogue in, I think, Rhode Island?
Yeah.
I think those are Portuguese Jews. I know they're Sephardic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and they were pushed out by the Portuguese Inquisition. I know for a fact that one of the oldest synagogues, if not the oldest synagogue in the United States, is in Savannah, Georgia. I've been to it. And they were all Sephardic Jews that escaped the Portuguese Inquisition. But by the time of the 20th century in Portugal, they would have definitely been fervently anti-Masonic. And you see that in the integralist and monarchist parties, and they make all these conspiracy theories about the Carbonaria and the Lodge. And what's funny to me, and this is something that
Although
my
some of
interest,
them, it turns out they had some reason to be a little bit
right? Well,
worried about
that's
them.
right. Like Carbonaria agents were two assassins on the king. But the thing that I want to mention is about that is that if you read the English language Wikipedia entries on this stuff, it is full of this like Judeo, or not really an anti-Masonic conspiracy theories. It's not Judeo-Masonic. And when you read the actual academic texts that are written on this, let me just get the quotation from Wheeler. Let's see. It's a really he says excuse me, I'm sorry, this is going to take a while. He says, if the Carbonaria contributed to the success of the revolution, here being the 1908 revolution, so did the atmosphere of the working class unrest and popular ferment in the cities and major towns, and the willingness of many Portuguese to support the changes. The Carbonaria represented only a small part of a much larger movement, the politicization of the urban working class. And so, in other words, the reason why people joined the Carbonaria is that there was already massive unrest in Portuguese cities, and the most extreme members of these of that unrest joined this secret organization. The lodge in Portugal was much more a kind of bourgeois institution, like it is here in the United States. And so it's not that they don't exist. Okay, but it's that they don't really matter as much as the theories play out them to be. But as we've talked about in that our second episode, the reason for them to make this charge is to have something to focus against. Right.
It's like
explanation
the
for why everything is
or
bad.
globalists or
exactly. Yeah, and as an explanation for why their own failures aren't failures. And the critical choice that Salazar made was not to do that anymore. He said, how about everyone shut up and get to work and do what you're told, or the PIDE are going to show up at your house, and there will be a blood spot where your body used to be. And it turned out that he didn't need to be as violent because everyone was so sick of violence already that they were just glad to be working. But it's not so lucky in other regimes, including Franco, who Salazar secretly hated.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Thought Franco was like this wild idiot, right? Salazar is this gentleman scholar, lives a very simple life of order, and
when Franco, he's not ordering his police to have people murdered.
Yeah, well, they were asking for it. Franco is like burning down Masonic lodges and sending raw materials to the Nazis. All very.
That Franco was just livid during the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah, so was Salazar.
Yeah. Oh, he was too.
It's not a coincidence that the Spanish and Portuguese representatives at the Second Vatican Council were on the other side of the DH discussion, right? Dignitatis Humanae.
Okay.
I want to say that's true. I've been told this, and I remember being told this. There may have been individual members of the Portuguese and Spanish clergy that were against it. I do know that there was a crazy document written under a pseudonym that was trying to prevent Nostra Aetate, which is the declaration for the protection of the Jews.
Yeah, I heard something about that.
And I forget what it's called, but
there's this famous anti-Semite Catholic author who I've heard there's rumors that he wrote some article. He wrote something under a pseudonym or something like that.
Yeah, and it was written written in collaboration, I know, with some Portuguese, Latin, like sort of broadly Latin American, but also Middle Eastern Catholic clergy that were concerned about Nostra Aetate. The thing about these regimes like Franco in Spain and Salazar in Portugal is that they last way longer than the political causes that led to their establishment.
That's right.
And so by the time Salazar's dead, the context has totally changed. Portugal was never in either of the wars. And Salazar is just kind of treated as this kind of necessary evil to get them out
Mm-hmm.
of the failed state that they had become by the 1910s.
Yeah.
And they would rather just forget about it, which, by the way, is true of Franco. I know we'll talk about Franco separately on another episode, but there's a really great book by a guy named Enrique Moradiellos or something like that. I can't quite read it from here, called Anatomy of a Dictator. Yeah, Franco, Anatomy of a Dictator. He doesn't talk about that anatomy. We just, just Franco was fat. That's what you don't need to know about the rest of his anatomy. But he does mention that like the immediate response to Franco's death for 2 decades, not immediate response, and then that lasts for another 2 decades after his death, is to act like Franco never happened. So aside
Wow.
from like a core group of phalangists and hardcore right-wing Catholics, the Spanish act like they've all got a kind of selective amnesia, because they would rather just forget that he ever happened. And that's sort of what I was seeing in that student I was talking to about Salazar.
Wow. I wonder if they would like that old SNL bit, right, where they say Generalissimo Franco is still dead. Do you remember that? Have you seen that
I
before?
do. It's like the first season. Like Jeffrey Chase would just show up on every weekend update and say that. It's I would like to break some news here today, Tom.
Oh, what's that?
Henry Leo Franco is still dead.
That's funny.
Not as dead as he used to be, I guess.
Yeah, they want him to come back.
All right.
Well,
that's
you
all
want
I
to lead
got
us out?
today.
Why don't you lead us out, James? You're better at this.
Well, everybody, thank you so much. This was a slightly shorter version. It's supposed to be the proper length of our podcast. We've had a lot of throat clearing to do. We've had a lot of crazy conspiracy theories to cover. And we had one superb philosopher to talk to. And one more, I should say, in addition to Tom, with Kevin. So this is going to be more of the ordinary length for our podcast. Again, I'm James Patterson. I've been talking to Thomas Howes, whose name I now pronounce correctly too. I forget in the previous episode with Kevin, I kept saying Meist and he kept saying de Maestra. And I just assume I'm saying it wrong because I'm from East Texas. And like, that's like what we do is we say things wrong. But I guess I'm supposed to do the whole YouTube spiel and podcast spiel where it's like, don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't leave a comment. We turn the comments off for reasons that should be obvious. But feel free to send us emails or messages on Twitter at why Postlib failed. You can also find Thomas and me on there, having a good time talking to people and getting into fights with University of Florida philosophers. So thank you so much and see us again Monday.
Bye, everyone.